My sister pushed me into a DNA test to prove I didn't belong. But when the lawyer read the results, he didn't look at me, he looked at her. The room went silent. The DNA kit sat on the conference table like a grenade somebody had already pulled the pin on. My sister Claire had placed it there herself. She was smiling the way people smile when they're absolutely certain they've won. That loose, private smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes because it doesn't need to. It had already arrived somewhere I couldn't follow. "Let's just settle this once and for all," she said. She meant, "Let's prove you don't belong here." I looked at the kit. I looked at her attorney, a man named Harmon who wore cufflinks to a Tuesday afternoon meeting like he was doing us all a favor by showing up. I looked at Claire's husband, Greg, who had the emotional range of a parking cone, but had apparently decided this occasion warranted a blazer. I looked at Claire's two friends, Dana and Michelle, who had no legal standing in that room and no reason to be there except front row seats to my humiliation. Then I looked at my mother, who was sitting very still at the end of the table with her hands folded in her lap, the way she used to sit in church when something was happening she didn't have words for. "Sure," I said. "I'll take the test." Claire blinked. She'd expected a fight. She'd braced for it. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, the slight forward lean, the chin already tilted up for the argument she'd rehearsed. I didn't give her one. I had already taken the test 6 weeks ago. "My name is Marcus. I'm 34 years old. I've been a licensed structural engineer for 8 years. Which means I spend my professional life calculating exactly how much stress a thing can bear before it fails. It turns out that skill transfers. I was adopted at 3 years old. My parents, Robert and Diane Calloway, never hid it. They celebrated it. Every year on what Mom called my gotcha day, she baked my favorite cake, lemon with cream cheese frosting, because I had apparently announced a preference for it at age 4, and she never let me forget it. Dad called me his chosen son, with the particular pride of a man who had thought very carefully about his words and decided those were exactly the right ones. Claire was 7 when I arrived. She's Robert and Diane's biological daughter, 5 years my senior, and for as long as I can remember, she has operated with the specific grievance of someone who believes a wrong was done to her that the world refuses to acknowledge. The word chosen, in her mind, implied she hadn't been, that she was the default, the one who simply was, while I had been selected, elevated, made special. She said once at a Christmas dinner when she was 26 and had clearly had too much wine, that it made her feel like second choice in her own home. Mom had looked at her with eyes that held 30 years of patience and said, "Claire, we didn't choose Marcus instead of you. We chose him because of you, because you needed a brother." Claire had excused herself from the table. She didn't speak to me for 4 months after that. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern. Dad died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that gives you very little warning and even less time. He was 68. He'd been a high school history teacher for 35 years. Coached JV baseball on the side, drove a 2009 Ford F-150 he'd named Gerald, and was the kind of man who remembered the names of every cashier at every grocery store he'd ever visited. He was also, I learned 3 months before he died, carrying a secret that had been slowly crushing him for the better part of a decade. He told me on a Tuesday in November. I'd come over to help him with his medications. By then, the cancer had progressed enough that the pill regimen was complicated, and Mom's hands shook too much for the pill organizer. We were sitting at the kitchen table. He'd sent Mom to her sister's for the afternoon, which I hadn't thought much of at the time. He told me quietly, the way he told me everything important. No preamble, no softening. Just the truth laid out plain and trusted to land where it needed to. He said he forgave her. He asked me not to say anything unless I had to. I told him I'd honor that. I meant it. I went home that night and sat in my car in the parking garage of my apartment building for 45 minutes, not moving. Then I ordered the DNA kit, not to use, just to have, just in case have to ever arrive. It arrived 6 weeks before Claire put her own kit on a conference table and smiled at me like I was already gone. The estate dispute started almost immediately after the funeral. Dad had been organized. He was a history teacher. He believed in documentation, and his will was clear. The house and most of the savings went to Mom, with the remainder of his personal estate split equally between Claire and me. Personal effects were itemized. There was a letter for each of us, sealed, in the attorney's file. Standard, careful, complete. Claire called me the night after the reading and said, very calmly, "He left half to a stranger." I remember the exact quality of the silence that followed that sentence, the way it sat in the phone line between us like something physical. "Claire," I said. "Don't," she said. "Just don't." She hung up. 3 days later, I received a letter from an attorney named Gerald Harmon, Escone, out of the firm Harmon and Bryce, LLC, informing me that Claire Calloway Dreyer was formally contesting the will on the basis that I had no biological claim to the Calloway estate, and requesting that I submit to DNA verification to confirm my status as a legal heir. I read the letter twice. I set it on my kitchen counter. I made coffee. I stood at the window looking out at the street below. It was 7:14 in the morning, and the city was doing its slow, indifferent wake-up, and I thought, she's really doing this. And then I thought, okay, documentation. Item 1, letter of contest, Harmon and Bryce LLC, dated November 4th. Formal request for biological verification of heir status. Case filed with probate court. Docket number 2023 PR 4471. Retained by counsel. Copy forwarded to the offices of Patricia Osei, estate attorney. I called Patricia Osei the same morning. Patricia had been Dad's attorney for 12 years. She drafted the will, she knew the family history, and she had the particular calm of a woman who had seen every variation of human ugliness that an estate dispute could produce and had decided long ago that none of it would move her. She was 61, had her JD from Georgetown, and wore reading glasses on a beaded chain that she would put on and take off with a precision that I came to understand was her tell for when she was deciding whether to be patient with you. They can request it, Patricia said. The court can compel it. It doesn't change the legal standing of the will. Adoption confers full inheritance rights, Marcus. That is settled law. But it will slow the process considerably and cost everyone money. What do you recommend? The glasses went on. Came off. I recommend you comply. Quickly. And I recommend you do your own testing simultaneously, privately, through a certified lab, so that we have an independent record. I told her I'd already done that. She paused for exactly 1 second. A Patricia Osei pause, which meant she was recalibrating something, and said, "Good, send me the results when they come in. Send them encrypted." I did. The results came back on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before the formal mediation was scheduled. I was at my desk, reviewing load calculations for a pedestrian bridge project in the east quarter of the city, when the email came in from Genopath Diagnostics, a CLIA-certified lab that Patricia had specifically recommended because their results held up in court and their documentation was thorough enough to satisfy judges who'd seen every flavor of forensic fraud. I read the results once, closed the laptop, went for a walk that lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, down to the river and back, in 31-degree weather without a hat, because I'd forgotten it on the hook by my door and didn't notice until I was already 4 blocks away and didn't care enough to go back. When I got home, I forwarded the results to Patricia. She called me within 20 minutes. "Marcus," she said, and something in her voice was different. A careful quality, a deliberateness that told me she'd read everything and was choosing her next words with the kind of precision you use when the wrong ones could shatter something. "I know," I said. "Do you want to talk about what this means for—" "Not yet. Let's get through the mediation first." Another pause. "All right, I'll prepare accordingly. I want you to know, Marcus, whatever happens in that room, your legal position is airtight. The adoption is uncontestable. Claire's challenge, even without the secondary findings, was always thin. With them," she didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. "I know," I said again. I didn't sleep well for the next 3 weeks. Not because I was afraid of what was coming, but because Dad had asked me to keep this quiet, and now I was carrying the weight of knowing I wouldn't be able to. Claire had made sure of that. Every action has an architecture. Every stress applied to a structure produces a corresponding force somewhere else. She'd pushed. Now something was going to give, and it wasn't going to be me. The 3 weeks between receiving my results and the mediation were the strangest of my life. I went to work. I ate. I called Mom every other day. Careful conversations about nothing. The weather, her garden, whether Gerald the truck needed an oil change since she was keeping it for sentimental reasons. I did not tell her what I knew. I did not tell her what was coming. I also, around day 11, received a text from my cousin Len, Claire's side, though he'd always been close with me, that said only, "She's been talking at the gym, at her book club, telling people the will is fraudulent, that you manipulated Dad. Heads up." I stared at that text for a long time. Then I screenshot it and sent it to Patricia. I want to be clear about something. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I'd spent 30 years absorbing Claire's particular brand of contempt, the eye rolls at family dinners, the comments about real family that she'd make just quietly enough to deny, the time she'd told Dad's friends at his retirement party that I was practically like a son to him, with the stress on practically so subtle most people missed it, the time she'd told Mom I was a legal liability to the estate, and I had absorbed all of it with the patience of someone who had decided very early that her approval was not a currency he intended to trade in. But there is a difference between patience and permission. She wanted documentation. She wanted proof. She wanted to stand in a room full of people and demonstrate, with evidence, who belonged and who didn't. She got what she asked for. That's not revenge, that's just physics. The night before the mediation, I sat in my apartment and read Dad's letter again. He'd left it with Patricia, sealed, to be opened after the will was read. I'd opened it the evening of the reading and read it alone in my car. The same parking garage, the same 45 minutes, except this time I was crying by the 3rd paragraph and didn't stop for a while. He'd written about the day they brought me home. He'd written about watching me figure out how the kitchen faucet worked at age 4. Apparently, I'd spent an entire Saturday afternoon testing the precise relationship between handle angle and water pressure, And he'd sat at the kitchen table pretending to read the paper while actually watching me with something he described as absolute certainty that we had done the right thing. He'd written about being proud of me. Specifically, carefully proud. Not the generic parental pride that gets applied like a coat of paint over everything, but the kind that comes from watching someone become a particular person and thinking, yes, that one. I'm glad I got to know that one. He'd written about Claire too. He'd written about loving her and worrying about her and the specific heartbreak of watching a person refuse to be comforted. He'd written, some people decide very young that they are owed something the world has withheld. I don't know where that comes from. I only know I couldn't fix it, though I tried for 40 years. And at the end, he'd written, Marcus, you know what I told you. If it ever comes to it, use your judgment. I trust yours. I folded the letter, put it in my jacket pocket, went to bed at 10:30 and lay in the dark for a while, listening to the city, thinking about load-bearing structures and what happens when you remove a foundational element from a design that was never quite sound to begin with. Then I went to sleep. The mediation was held at the offices of Colton and Associates, a neutral party recommended by the probate court. The mediator was a man named David Okafor, 22 years in estate law, former assistant district attorney, the kind of person who has watched enough human catastrophe that he has developed a quality of absolute stillness that does not read as cold so much as prepared. He'd reviewed all submitted documentation the previous day. Patricia had made sure our packet was complete. The will, the adoption papers, the legal precedents on adoptee inheritance rights, the results from genopath diagnostics, and a one-page summary that she described, when she sent it to me for review, as accurate, clinical, and unfortunately thorough. I arrived at 9:45 for a 10 a.m. session. The offices were on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a conference room that had large windows and a long oak table, and the particular charged quiet of a space where difficult things happen regularly. Claire was already there. She'd brought Harmon, who was as cufflinked as advertised, with a leather portfolio and the particular energy of a man who charges $400 an hour and wants you to feel every dollar. She'd brought Greg, who shook my hand with the kind of firm but empty grip of a man who has been coached to perform confidence. And she'd brought Dana and Michelle, who introduced themselves as support when Patricia quietly asked who they were, and who Patricia regarded with the expression of a woman deciding whether to make an issue of something and choosing, for now, not to. Mom came with me. Just Mom. She wore the gray cardigan she always wore to things she considered serious, and she hugged me in the lobby and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. We took our seats. Okafor arranged his papers. Patricia had her own folder open, pen uncapped, reading glasses in place. Harmon made a brief opening statement about the nature of the contest. Biological verification as a precondition of legitimate inheritance, he said, and the word legitimate sat in the room like a thumbtack on a chair nobody had noticed yet. Okafor listened, nodded, made a note. Then he opened his own folder. The DNA results submitted by both parties have been reviewed and authenticated by this office, he said. The results submitted by Harmon and Bryce are consistent with the results submitted by Ms. Osei's office, and both are consistent with the findings of genopath diagnostics. He looked at both sides of the table with the same measured attention. I'll now read the findings for the record. Claire straightened in her chair. Greg put his hands flat on the table. Dana touched Michelle's wrist. Harmon clicked his pen. The DNA results confirm, Okafor began, that Marcus Calloway is not a biological relative of the deceased, Robert James Calloway. Claire exhaled. It was the exhale of someone releasing 30 years of held breath. Long, quiet, controlled. Her shoulders dropped a full inch. Greg nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming a vote. Dana's mouth curved. As anticipated, Harmon said, uncapping his pen and drawing a line through something on his yellow legal pad. Therefore, by the contested biological heir standard, I'm not finished, Okafor said. Harmon stopped mid-click. Okafor turned the page. He didn't look up immediately. He read something at the top of the second page, which I knew, because Patricia had submitted it and I had reviewed every word, was the secondary findings summary from genopath diagnostics, flagged automatically by their processing algorithm, because that is what certified forensic labs do when they identify a statistically significant anomaly in familial DNA matching. When he looked up, he looked at Claire. Not at me, not at Harmon, at Claire, and I watched her face do something I had never seen it do in 34 years of knowing her. It went uncertain, just for a second, just a flicker of something that had no name yet because she didn't know enough to name it. A secondary match was flagged during processing, Okafor said. His voice was completely level, a professional voice. The voice of a man delivering information, not judgment. The test identified a previously unknown biological relationship within the family. What does that mean? Claire said. Okafor set the paper down. He clasped his hands. He looked at her the way I imagined he'd looked at hundreds of people in that room over 22 years, with the carefully managed compassion of someone who knows what they're about to do and has made peace with the necessity of it. Claire, he said. The results indicate a low probability of shared paternity with the deceased. Silence. Not the polite conference room kind. Not the brief gap between sentences kind. The kind that fills your ears. The kind that has a texture. I'm sorry? Claire said. The DNA suggests that you and Marcus share a mother. He set the paper down with both hands, flat on the table. But not the same father. Greg's head turned. Slowly, the way a camera pans when the director wants you to see something you're not ready for. He turned and looked at his wife with an expression I didn't have a word for. Not anger, not disbelief, but something more fundamental, like a man watching a building he'd believed was solid beginning to list. Dana and Michelle looked at each other. The front row seat energy had gone completely out of them. They looked like two people who had wandered into a movie expecting a comedy and were somewhere deep in the third act before realizing what genre they were actually in. That's not possible, Claire said. Her voice had changed. Not gone quiet exactly, gone small. The words came out flat and dull, like something that had used up all its energy getting to the surface. The test was administered by an independent CLIA-certified laboratory, Okafor said. The results are court admissible. Harmon looked at his legal pad. He had nothing to write. He uncapped his pen and capped it again. A reflex with nowhere to go. Patricia hadn't moved. She was watching the room with the stillness of someone who had known this moment was coming and had done everything she could to prepare for it, and now understood that preparation only gets you so far. Mom's hands, folded in her lap, had gone very still. She was looking at the middle of the table at nothing in particular, and her face had a quality I recognized from the hardest moments of my childhood. Not grief, exactly, but the expression that comes just before grief arrives, when you can feel it approaching and you're gathering yourself. I looked at Claire. Dad knew, I said. The room shifted. Everyone looked at me, even Harmon. He told me 3 months before he died. I kept my voice flat. Not cold, flat. There's a difference. Cold is a weapon. Flat is just information. He said he forgave her. He asked me not to say anything unless I had to. Claire's mouth had come open slightly. She was staring at me like I'd started speaking a language she didn't know she'd been hearing wrong her entire life. Then why? She started. Because you pushed, I said. You wanted proof of who belongs in this family. I reached into my jacket pocket and slid a copy of my private genopath results across the table. The ones I'd run 6 weeks ago. The ones that showed everything. My results, her results, the paternity flag, the probability statistics, the lab certification, the chain of custody documentation. Patricia had submitted the official copy to Okafor already, but I'd brought this one for Claire specifically. I'd thought about whether to do that and decided yes. She needed to see it with her hands, not hear it read aloud. See it. Hold it. You got it, I said. Greg stood up. His chair scraped the floor loud enough that Dana flinched. He didn't say anything to Claire. He didn't look at her. He picked up his phone and his jacket from the back of his chair, walked to the door, opened it, and left. Not angry loud, not dramatic. Just gone. The door clicked shut behind him with the quiet finality of a decision that has already been made. Dana grabbed her bag. She looked at Michelle. Michelle was already half standing. They made it to the door without making eye contact with anyone on either side of the table. Harmon, to his credit, waited until they'd left before he quietly gathered his papers, murmured something professionally non-committal in Okafor's direction, and excused himself. And then it was just us. Okafor, Patricia, Mom, me, and Claire, sitting alone on her side of the table in her blazer with her hands flat on the genopath results, looking at something that wasn't in the room. Patricia spoke first, quietly and precisely. For the record, Marcus Calloway's legal standing as an heir of the Robert Calloway estate is fully confirmed by settled adoption law, independent of the biological findings. The contest is effectively withdrawn. She looked at Okafor. He nodded. She capped her pen. Mom hadn't moved. Now she looked at Claire, and I watched her look, and what I saw in it was not anger and not triumph, and not even vindication. It was the look of a woman who has spent 40 years loving someone through their own resistance, and is very, very tired. You were always enough, Mom said softly. You just never let yourself believe it. I don't know how long the silence lasted after that. Long enough that the city outside the 14th floor windows felt very far away. Long enough that the quality of light in the room seemed to shift. Claire opened her mouth, closed it, looked down at the paper under her hands. The probability statistics were right there. Estimated shared paternity, 3.2%. Confidence interval, 99.1%. Lab certification, number GPD 2023-114872. A clean, clinical, undeniable accounting of a secret that had been held for decades and was now just a document in a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I picked up my copy of the results, the private one, the one I'd brought for her, that she hadn't touched, folded it once, and tucked it back in my pocket. She hadn't needed to hold it after all. She had her own copy now. She'd always have her own copy. I paused at the door. I thought about saying something. There were 100 things I could have said. 30 years worth of accumulated weight that I'd never voiced, never deployed, never used, because I'd always told myself it wasn't worth it, that she wasn't worth that version of me. I still believed that, so I just left. That was 11 months ago. The estate was settled 6 weeks after the mediation. Patricia handled it efficiently, as she handles everything. The will stood exactly as written. Mom got the house and the savings. Claire and I split what remained of Dad's personal estate, as he'd intended. Gerald the truck is parked in Mom's driveway. She doesn't drive it. She just keeps it there. Greg filed for divorce in January. I don't know the details and I didn't ask. Len told me Claire had moved into an apartment and was seeing a therapist, which I genuinely hope is helping her. I mean that without irony. Whatever she did to me, whatever she cost our family, she also lost something in that conference room that she'll spend a long time trying to understand. I don't have to be glad about that to be clear-eyed about it. I had dinner with Mom last week. She made lemon cake. Not for any occasion, just because she felt like it. We sat in the kitchen where Dad used to sit and watch me mess with the faucet, and we talked about nothing important for a long time. She asked me if I was all right. I told her I was. She looked at me the way she always looks at me when she's deciding whether to believe me, and then she nodded and cut me a second slice. I am all right, mostly. There's a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing a fight, but from winning one you never wanted to have. I didn't want to be in that room. I didn't want to use what I knew. I didn't want any of it. But Claire put the kid on the table and smiled her certain smile, and called me a stranger in front of our mother. And some things, once set in motion, follow their own logic to their own conclusions, regardless of what you intended when you started. She wanted to know who belonged. That was always the wrong question. The right question was whether she could have loved the answer, whatever it turned out to be. She couldn't, so she never got to find out what it felt like. Dad knew. He'd made his peace with all of it. The secret, the marriage, the complicated geometry of a family that doesn't map cleanly onto the simple shapes people want it to be. He'd made his peace, and he'd loved every one of us anyway. Specifically, stubbornly, without condition. That's what the letter said. That's what I keep coming back to. He was a history teacher. He understood that the past doesn't disappear. It just stops being the future. You carry it, or it carries you. That's the choice. Claire chose to let it carry her for 30 years. All the way into a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in November, with cufflinks and a legal brief and 2 friends who thought they were there to watch a victory. I chose differently. I had a lot of time to practice. She wanted proof of who belonged. Now she has to figure out if she does. I already know the answer to my version of that question. I've known it since I was 3 years old, sitting in a kitchen figuring out how the faucet worked, while my father pretended to read the paper. If you read this far, you know what it costs to write it. Hit like. Leave a comment. Tell me if your family has a Claire. I promise I'll read everyone.